So we're very excited to have Joshua Becker talk to us today. Kind of a side note, we like bringing in people from outside of the field once in a while in order to get fresh ideas. And we think that this was a very fruitful area that maybe will yield to some collaborative research between marketing and other fields. So with that in mind, why don't you take it away, Josh?
Great, thank you. So hello, everybody. I'll actually introduce myself now. My name is Joshua Becker, and I am a brand new assistant professor at the UCL School of Management. That's at the University College London, although currently broadcasting still from Chicago, where I just wrapped up a 2-year postdoc at the Kellogg School of Management. So the research that I'm going to talk about today is all about belief accuracy. I'm starting with the very touchy term belief. I know the word belief means a lot of things to a lot of different people, particularly people who have a Bayesian perspective on a very particular interest in understanding the word belief. Oh, sorry about that. Gotta get this screen sharing again. So what I mean by belief are things like questions about numeric accuracy. So these are things like asking questions. You might be making some strategic market entry decisions. So you want to know how many people will be making their first time home purchase in the next year, or maybe a little bit, more directly it operates. You're deciding maybe to launch a new product, and you just want to estimate, with this particular product, and given everything we know, how many units can we expect to sell in the first year, some particular time horizon, and then even more, operationally oriented decision, how much will it cost to build some particular software project. I personally also used to work in hiring and customer service, and I knew eventually everybody would be scored on their performance. So for me, hiring was like a forecasting decision for each candidate. I would ask, what's your quality score going to be in 1 year, and will my boss be glad I hired you? So I'm specifically looking at numeric accuracy. So if you ever hear me slip up and talk about beliefs very broadly, what I mean is your answer to these questions. So, what is the number that you give in answer to these questions? So there are a couple different strategies for optimizing that, and the question that really interests me is how can we get the most accurate number in response to that question? One very popular strategy these days is simply to take the average of a large number of people. Now, I want to offer a brief comment that it's, of course, increasingly common that people are using formal statistical models to try to quantify and predict these things, and yet subjective estimates, so the gut estimate, just coming up with a number based on the information I have, remain very important. In things like forecasting, like economic forecasting, subjective estimates remain particularly important when in unusual circumstances, when the predictive models, maybe aren't calibrated to those situations. Those unusual circumstances are precisely where we most want to reduce uncertainty. One strategy for getting the most accurate gut or subjective estimates is to take advantage of the wisdom of crowds, which is just to take the average of a lot of people instead of just the answer of one person. And just very briefly, there is a mathematical guarantee that the average estimate from a number of people will be more accurate or have lower error, and that's measured in terms of squared error or closely related absolute deviation, so just the absolute value of the error, than a randomly selected individual. In other words, the error of the average is mathematically guaranteed to be smaller than the average error of individuals within your group. So you get a nice statistical boost to this wisdom of crowds method. And the common perspective is that you need to keep people independent. So I call this collected intelligence because you're collecting answers or contributions of a number of independent contributors. Now that works really well, and there's a whole lot of work about how to extract, the most optimal number out of that vector of numbers you get, using things like auxiliary information, asking people how confident are you, or measuring their past success and accuracy. So there's a lot of work to improve that collected intelligence. And that works well in a lot of situations, but it also has limitations. One limitation being it may not be feasible to actually keep people independent. So it's very important for us to know what is it that happens when our group members start talking to each other. It also may not be desirable for various reasons to keep people independent. There's a lot of potential benefits, and I'll acknowledge these aren't really clearly understood yet. That's a future research area, but benefits to letting people talk, sharing information that can produce social learning effects. So not only can it be difficult to stick with this collected intelligence perspective, but we may be failing to take advantage of what I call the collective intelligence perspective. And for the real distinction about collective intelligence is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The whole is not just a linear combination of those individuals. So one very, very popular example of what I would call this collective intelligence approach is the Delphi method. The Delphi method was developed during the heyday of groupthink research back in the 60s. And it varies widely in practice, but a very basic version would have your group members first produce their independent individual estimates, so that wisdom of crowd's baseline, and then they would share their numbers. So they'd write down their numbers on a slip of paper. Some mediator would aggregate them all, maybe take the average and the range, distribute that information to participants so they could answer again. So basically it's a way of social learning while mitigating the risks associated with normative influence or other factors that can lead to groupthink. And there are various variations on this. So the question then becomes, which is better? Allowing people to just contribute independent estimates, allowing them to learn from each other, and then within this collective space of interaction, how exactly should we have people interact? So one strategy would be, as I mentioned, to aggregate independent estimates. One strategy would be to aggregate those estimates after just letting people talk. So some form of just informal discussion. I mean, literally people sitting around a table having conversation. And then one strategy would be to aggregate estimates after a mediated process, such as the Delphi method. So I want to take a quick poll. I didn't actually set this up in Zoom. I think you had to do it before logging in. So you can feel free to either think your answer to yourself, or even better me, put it into the chat window, because I'm truly very curious what your answers to this are. So the poll is, if you have some team and you need them to come up with the most accurate numeric estimate possible, which strategy would you personally use? Aggregate their independent estimate, aggregate after having a conversation, or aggregate after some mediated process. And you'll notice that all of these are aggregate, because we already know that there's a pretty decent statistical benefit to aggregation. Okay, if you either entered or quietly thought your answer to yourself, then I'll tell you that no matter what answer you put in, there's going to be evidence supported. So there are studies that compare the Delphi method, which I'll call numeric exchange, people sharing numbers, with unstructured discussion, and they say numeric exchange is better. There's some studies that say unstructured discussion is better than numeric exchange. There are some studies, both older and more recent, that continue to argue any social influence undermines the wisdom of the crowd. So the data is all over the place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually step back for a minute and ask a broader research question. It's a very generic question. How does communication shape belief accuracy? And we'll get back into these specific things. I'm going to offer you some answers to this question today. Very briefly, I want to acknowledge that what we're going to end up with is that there is no main effect. We can't simply ask the question, is social influence for belief accuracy, yes or no? We can't even really ask, as it's going to turn out, is discussion better than numeric exchange. There's no simple answer to this question. It turns out it's really a contingency effect. It depends on things like the network structure and the task itself. So, okay, now I'm going to dive very quickly into some of the basics there. I'm going to start by going super
Josh,
briefly
can I ask,
through the...
Josh, do you mind if I ask
Yes.
a sort of preliminary question?
Yeah.
So
I'm actually going to have a pause for a question slide in just a moment. I just want to get, just the momentum to let people know where I'm going, and that may partially answer some of the questions. I'm going to go very briefly through a theoretical model, statistical assessment of how people react to each other, very, very quickly through a basic test of some of the basic applications of that model. Nothing surprising there. I'm going to dwell a little while on this numeric versus discussion topic, because for me as a former mediator, actually running processes, thinking about how that process runs is an important question to me. And then at the end, if we have time, I'm going to break that up a little bit and introduce a new puzzle about the type of estimation. So I'm happy to take questions at this time. Sorry about that.
No, that's perfect. So I just wanted to understand, for this talk, we're going to table issues of sort of incentives on how people respond to the question. We're going to assume that they're sort of happy to truthfully tell us their beliefs and things like that, which is fine. I just wanted to make sure that we're setting like incentive compatibility stuff aside.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Now, experimentally, what we're doing, and I'm going to talk about our methods in a few minutes, is we pay people to be accurate. But I live in a nice little dream world where I assume that everybody genuinely wants to answer their questions honestly and accurately. I understand that's not always the case, but even within that space, we're already looking at decades of conflicting evidence on this question. So absolutely right. I am abstracting away the very realistic concerns that are going to come up when you walk into a room with real people making a real decision, so that we can try to get a grip on some of these very basic questions. Because what I'm going to end up with is a model that shows why each of these previous results are actually explainable as different points in the underlying parameter space. And then what I think I'll be doing after today, which is say it's my future research, is build up back in these complexities, hopefully with the help of people like you, to think about things like incentives. Now, if you bring that up again at the end, I'll have a few comments on what we think so far about that. But okay, so pause for other questions.
There are no other questions. Maybe I'll just follow up on Johan's question. So how should you think of discussion or communication in the context of unclear objectives for why that might be? I mean, if you set up a clear purpose or an incentive, I might have an incentive to influence somebody or try to convert them into something closer to my beliefs. In the absence of that, what would be the role of communication?
You mean, why are they sharing with
or
each other?
Why do you think they are sharing information?
Yeah, I think that's actually a great question. And we have experiments, and some of them are chat rooms, and they do share with each other, and all we sort of give them, actually, I'm remembering now our instructions, one incentive would be to share with others so that they share with me. Because if I'm personally incentivized to be as accurate as possible, then I may be able to expect there's a lot of norms of reciprocity there. So if I think I can benefit from social learning, which is of course a lot of evidence to suggest that I can. Another is just norms and habits, or maybe if your manager sits you down and says, okay, my team of 5 or 6 people, at the end of today, I want you to give me a number. How much is it going to cost to build this? They may have some team incentives or just a habit of doing what their manager told them. But if you ask me about that at the end, there's some Niccolo Piscatelli. This is not a study I've been involved in, but some people are starting to delve into like the group incentives versus individual incentive space. And there's some interesting, promising leads there, but not a ton as far as I know yet. Okay, so I'm going to push forward. There's going to be another pause for questions slide again soon. So, okay, so very briefly, I'm building on the group model developed by Martin in 1974, which is a model of opinion formation, not accuracy per se, but I'm going to use it to infer some ideas about group dynamics of accuracy. Very briefly, we assume that everybody starts with an initial estimate. They then can learn what the numbers, so these are numeric estimates given by their peers, are. They can then revise their answer. They then observe their peers' revised answer, and you rinse and repeat, so asymptotically. So de Groot showed us a couple things. One is that if you repeat this process infinitely, people converge on a single shared consensus estimate. That may not be very plausible, especially in finite time meetings. They may feel infinite, but real world is finite time. But we can use these properties to tell us the direction in which people are going. So the key result there is that the consensus estimate, the asymptotic point, is equal to the initial vector of estimates multiplied by, let's get my vectors right, multiplied by weights, and each person's individual weight is determined by their network centrality. Very simple, very intuitive. The more central you are in the network, the more people you influence, and the more influence you have on them, the more weight you'll have in the collective estimate. Now, I want to acknowledge there's two distinct important ways to become central. One is to have a whole lot of friends. The more people I influence, the more I'm going to contribute to the estimate. And the other is to be very influential on those to whom I am connected. So maybe I have only one friend, but I can tell them, you know, they just do whatever I say. So that can also increase my influence. And these two factors are going to have kind of distinct roles in what I'm talking about as I move forward. So I just wanted to signal that difference. So what does this mean for us from an accuracy perspective? It means that all we should really be thinking about to understand the dynamics of group behavior is network centralization. So centrality is a score that gets applied to individuals. I have a centrality score. How many friends do I have? How influential am I on my friends? The network as a whole has a centralization score, and you can measure that with a Gini coefficient. So centralization just asks, you know, how evenly distributed are those centrality scores? So this example on the left, decentralized, everybody's equally connected. Example on the right, one person maximally centralized. So the very boring, exciting result here is that if we have a network where everybody's fully decentralized, the group should converge right on that simple average. If we have a network where it's maximally centralized, we're not really getting the wisdom of crowds, we're getting the wisdom of the few, or wisdom of the ones. So roughly speaking, we should expect better results in a decentralized network because it's going to preserve the wisdom of crowds with no real change. And we should expect some unbinding of the results in the centralized networks. Now that's a broad take. I'm going to complicate that a little bit more. And I see that my co-author Abdullah Almaatouq is here as well. And he's definitely got a lot more complication for that. So hopefully by the end of this talk, I will make Abdullah happy. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm just going to talk you briefly through some experimental methods that I'm going to use a few times in the remaining 25 minutes I give myself for the talking period of this. So what we do, we recruit people from the web to complete a series of estimation tasks, such as how many M&Ms are in this jar, how many calories are in this meal, you know, how much does this consumer goods or basket of goods cost. We then allow people to observe each other through some mechanism and revise. So it could be, in some cases, it's going to be informal discussion. We just plop them into a chat room. Some cases, it's going to be more like the Delphi method or numeric exchange, where we literally just shuffle the numbers between them. And then we get a final answer after whatever the process is. And what we do is we just take the average of the initial answer, the average of the final answer, and we say, did it become more accurate, yes or no, and if so, by how much? Okay, so that's the basic experimental paradigm that includes both my research, some data from previous experiments that I'm going to reanalyze, as well as a lot of the classic studies on belief accuracy. So for this point, I'm going to pause for questions just in case anybody has any basic methods questions about what we're doing.
Can you clarify when in the time where people get to revise their answers, what do they see? Did they see the distribution or the average or the median? What do they know about the answers?
In the first study I'm going to talk about, they see just the average, and that's because in that study we care a lot about network structure. We don't want them to know how many peers they have. There's also some evidence that suggests that people are kind of responding to that when you show them a list. In the second study I'm going to talk about, we did show them the full list of answers. So actually see they're in groups of 20 at that point. They see a list of 19 answers in random order. We also show them the average. In that study, there are some studies, a very famous study by Jan Lorenz with Dirk Helbing, where they have a couple versions. They show some histograms, they show some line graphs. For these broad effects I'm talking about, that so far that doesn't seem to matter, but I'm not going to say that too confidently because it could turn out later.
As a participant is to come up with the most accurate answer.
Yeah. In all of the studies that I'm going to be talking about today, so I won't mention this again, but we're paying them for the accuracy of each answer entered. So at each round of the game, if when they're answering multiple times, they are incentivized to be as accurate as possible, and it's not competitive, right? So their payment doesn't depend on other people's payment. So we're at least not giving them any incentive to deceive. But people may try to do that anyway. There's obviously a lot of variance in individual responses.
And we care about whether or not the final answer is accurate, or did the kind of mean square error for each person is worse, or what do we care about? Just the final. The researchers from the perspective of my study care about the average answer. So the literal mean, we take the mean of all the people, we compare the mean at the beginning, the mean at the end, and we say, did it become more accurate? So I'm thinking from the perspective of, okay, I'm leading a software development team. We need to have a cost projection. I've heard the statistical benefit to taking the average, so I'm going to ask my whole team instead of just coming up with a number on my own. So we're looking at whether that crowd wisdom point becomes more or less accurate. Okay.
Continuing to pause for a second. Cool. Okay. So in this first study, what we're doing, we have people come in. They give an initial independent estimate. That's estimate number 1. We then show them the average answer of other people in the experiment. They give a revised estimate. That's estimate number 2. We then show them the average revised estimate. They give a third and final estimate. So they give 3 estimates. We're comparing the average at the beginning to the average at the end and asking, did it become more accurate? They're all getting paid to be as accurate as possible at each time. And what we're doing, I'm going through this very briefly because it's just setting up some intuitions. We're randomly assigning them to either a social condition with 40 people embedded in a decentralized network where everybody has 4 peers, or 40 people embedded in a centralized network with one central member and 39 peripheral nodes who all observe only that central member, which means, yes, the average that those peripheral nodes are seeing actually just equal to the central node's opinion. And then we also have a control condition. This turns out to be important, which is, sorry, I can't seem to turn off that ring in the background without also muting your sound. So the control condition is people all answering the exact same question in the same number of times with the same incentives, same amount of time. They just don't get that social information in between rounds. It's otherwise identical. So very briefly, the results of this study. First of all, the centralized network, exactly as you'd expect, the trajectory of the group belief is highly predicted by the initial belief of the central node, right? It's something like the correlation was 0.92 between the belief of the initial central node and the trajectory of the group as a whole. Nothing surprising there. I'm going to mention one important feature of that, though. This is very geeky, but it's going to be important later, which is that whether or not this group becomes more accurate doesn't simply depend on the accuracy of the central node. It actually depends on what direction the central node is in relative to the group as a whole. So you could have a central node that's way on left field, but by virtue of being pulled in that direction, the group still gets better. So that's an important distinction. It's not accuracy, but direction. Now, for the decentralized networks, remember we expected them just to converge on the average. What we found was that the decentralized networks in study became reliably more accurate in trial after trial. We didn't expect that. So at this point, we had to kind of go back to our theory. one of the nice things about starting with a formal model, forces you to think through, what are my assumptions? What we initially modeled and theoretically was that their response to social influence, so how much they adjust, we just assumed it was randomly distributed, IID. However, in practice, it turns out there was a pretty real correlation between accuracy and adjustment. So people who were more accurate made smaller adjustments. People who were less accurate made larger adjustments. When you feed this back into the model, it can explain the groups improving. And one way to think about that in terms of the de-group model, remember I said it always comes back to centrality and centralization, is that if I am more stubborn, I am placing more weight on my own belief. That's like a self loop in a network. So I'm actually increasing my own network centrality just by being stubborn. So that's how you can think about that in terms of the de-group model. Now we wanted to get beyond this theoretically, we also wanted to see this empirically. What we did was we took each trial in this experiment. That particular trial, we measured the error adjustment correlation. And then when we plot that out, we see that by and large, the groups with a very strong positive correlation, so high error, high estimate, saw a large negative change in error. And down is good. Down means a decrease in error. So what we're seeing is that both theoretically and empirically, this error adjustment correlation can explain reliable improvement because most of the points are in that low right quadrant where we see a positive, a positive correlation accompanied with a decrease in error. So, okay, that's kind of our background setup of some very, very basic sanity test of the network model and some predictions about people under equal influence. Often the point at which someone raises their hand and says, yeah, but Joshua, that's all well and good when people are counting gumballs in a jar. Does this for stuff we really care about? So I'm just going to briefly mention. We've also studied this in some political contexts, a lot of caveats there, still a laboratory experiment, a lot of complications of politics, but we were able to replicate these results under cases where people are going to be driven by cognitive biases. Now, I'm not going to say that numeric exchange in decentralized networks will always improve accuracy. So far, we have a couple studies that shows that on average, it seems to improve accuracy. But we do still have these points in the upper left-hand quadrant, upper left-hand quadrant where we see the most accurate people making large adjustments and the group gets worse. So we know that this is a possibility. And so what we have is our first contingency. One contingency that determines the effect of social influence on group belief accuracy is this error adjustment correlation. So, okay. Pause for questions on this just basic step into the theoretical and empirical worlds here.
So I have a question about the asymmetry, which it was a little bit, I was having trouble following it because I wasn't sure if it was sort of like an asymmetric relationship, but it inspired in me a question, which was when you have this centralized network, I don't know if the following is, if there's light shed on the following question in that the initial work you were describing, but there's sort of this question of, is there an asymmetry of sort of overestimation versus underestimation, which for various reasons that I could maybe expand on, but I'll leave to you to field however you want. You could start to believe that maybe people are making order of magnitude guesses and sort of that whole question about the distribution. I don't know, which is sort of something that sometimes comes up in this literature. But in general, do you see that there's more sort of more reliance empirically on overestimates than underestimates, or the other way around? Which would suggest that people have some awareness that like the tails of the distribution are not the same. That like so in this, I'm thinking specifically in the centralized experiments, and like when the leader is like way off up or way off down.
That's a great question. So I can tell you empirically, in terms of independent distributions, we tend to see fairly skewed estimates. So right skewed, log normal, order of magnitude type skews as you'd expect. I never really thought about how people respond to social information with some understanding of those skew in mind. So I'm not sure, honestly.
We'd love to chat
So
offline. Okay, cool.
So what I'll give my generic response to that question, which is going to be the response to a lot of questions about what about this, what about that, all the complications that I'm dissolving away. So what we're finding so far, hopefully I'll convince you of that in the next 15 minutes, is that at least for the big picture effects at the group level, the very simple models that we're starting with can explain the broad strokes dynamics. So these kinds of things like how do I respond to a huge overestimate versus a huge underestimate, so far we haven't had to worry about those yet, but by the end I'm going to talk about all these various contingencies and calibrations, so those avenues may end up being useful ways to loop back around and solve some of the problems that I'm going to leave open. So those are also things like, you know, status and, you know, how do I respond to someone who's really nice versus mean, or someone, you know, with really convincing stuff. So far, we haven't had to account for that to, you know, show that these models do a pretty good job of explaining the basic space for it. Okay, so I started with this poll of how do you have people give you their estimates independently, after numeric exchange, after informal discussion. I took this detour through network structure, and it's not really going to answer the question, the network structure alone. In order to answer this question, this problem of does it matter if we use a mediated process, or even just can informal conversation improve belief accuracy? Can I let my team have their weekly meetings before, you know, making their budget forecasts? In order to answer that question, I need to put forward a hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that unstructured discussion or informal discussion, people sitting around a table or a chat room, acts like a centralized network. And the intuition, hopefully, is very straightforward. If I have a bunch of people sitting around in a conversation, one of them, possibly me, is going to be very talkative. And we know that all sorts of features like how much a person talks, if they repeat the same point, if they're taller, if they're very attractive, if they have high status, all of these things can make people more influential. So this is now where we're moving away from that simple notion of centrality as just how many friends do I have, very structural perspective on group belief formation, to a more process-oriented concept of centralization, which is how does my centralization emerge through the process? So for those of you who are Giddens fans, I think of this more the structuration approach, because we're still going to say things like network structure matter, but that structure is actually produced by the individuals in the group. So that's my hypothesis, is that unstructured discussion acts like centralized networks. So what does this mean for unstructured discussion? What does it mean for the comparison to numeric estimates? And what are we going to look for empirically if we want to compare them? So what we need to do is to go back to that kind of geeky thing I said earlier about how for centralized networks, think again about that one single leader type network. It's not really about how accurate that person is, but whether they pull the group in the correct direction or not. So consider this hypothetical belief distribution here. The red line shows the mean, the dashed line shows the truth. Remember, our question is, does that red line move closer to the truth? So is it moving to the right during conversation, or is it moving to the left? In this distribution, this is just an arbitrary one I drew, we have 20% of the group members are on the truth side of the mean, and 80% of the group members are not on the truth side of the mean. So if we're randomly selecting a central node, which isn't always the case empirically, but in our experiments we are, and in a lot of the experimental data we're trying to explain, people are just random, we would have a 20% chance of picking someone who's going to pull the group in the right direction, 80% chance of picking someone who's going to pull the group in the wrong direction. So if we were to look back at our star networks for this task, we would find, we would expect to find that centralization makes the group worse. They're being pulled in the wrong direction 80% of the time. If we were to flip this, which is to say, if we were to ask a different question with a different distribution, we would find the opposite outcome. We might find that centralization makes things better. So what I'm arguing is that the effect of centralization and ultimately the effect of unstructured or informal discussion on a group is going to be driven by the pre-discussion belief distribution. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the technical details. Today we have a working paper set up around that operationalizes this. I call it phi, just the proportion of people in the direction of truth. We draw some formal connection to an analysis by Abdullah Almaatouq, who I think is here today, and a couple other very good people, I think all at MIT actually, who give a more detailed mathematical analysis of this. But today I'll be largely talking about this heuristic, this question of phi. So that's the intuition. The belief distribution impacts the effect of unstructured discussion. I'm going to pause for questions because this basic setup is very important to everything I'm going to talk about for the next 7 to 10 minutes.
Can I ask a question about, so you're making an assumption about the distribution of the beliefs about the actual thing you're asking about, but there's also the belief distribution about the weight of these individuals, or when they have this initial discussion, how I update my beliefs about, or how to select information that I confirm to in some sense.
Yeah,
how do we separate those?
Currently, for the purposes of the present, this argument so far, we can complicate it later, is I'm assuming people are randomly assigned. Now, in our experiments, the feature that we find very predictive, hopefully I'll get to this today, is how talkative people are. So we do find that the most talkative person in a group can accurately predict outcomes. Now, when I went into this, I thought I would find a correlation between talkativeness and accuracy. We'd already found a correlation between stubbornness and accuracy. Other people have found a correlation between confidence and accuracy with an asterisk. I know that's not always true for binary choice questions. Seems to be common for numeric estimates. But empirically, so far, we see zero correlation. And I don't mean statistically insignificant. I mean 0.0 correlation, both in some data I've looked at elsewhere, as well as in our replication data. So there seems to be no correlation between talkativeness and accuracy. So in terms of the emergent dynamics of our laboratory study, I find no reason or no need or nothing to think about a correlation between beliefs and influence in the network. Now, in empirical settings, that may be the case. So there's one very easy case where we have one person and we just know they're our leader and they're our leader for a reason and they're always right. Well, that's great. You should definitely listen to that person. And none of the problems we're talking about today are problems, because if you already know who's right in your group, you already know what the right answer is. So partially for those more challenging situations where you don't have a clear idea of who's got the right answer, in which case you can use other methods. And also, again, for some of these more basic principles, trying to dial back the complications so we can make sense out of what currently is a very messy laboratory space. And then later we'll want to bring back in things like status and influence.
Okay, but in that particular case that you described, and that's essentially what I was getting at, there's a naturally chosen leader, and people have, maybe they put higher weights on the information that they receive from this person. And in that case, wouldn't you expect sort of a higher accuracy in some sense, shrinkage in the...
You may, I would expect a higher influence. I'm not sure I would expect a higher accuracy. It depends heavily on context, because people can obtain status for all sorts of reasons. So we often see celebrities who get status due to expertise in, fashion or acting. They then start to express opinions on things like healthcare and politics. So there's a lot of mechanisms that can lead to influence and centrality that is completely uncorrelated with accuracy. Now, I'm not going to say that's always the case. But again, if you have a leader and you just know they're always right, you don't really have a hard problem to solve. You already know who's got the right answer. So we're interested in an ambiguous case. And again, in just trying to make sense out of some of frankly, the laboratory results, which do set aside a lot of empirical concerns in field experiments, but right now we're just trying to make sense of that. So, okay, I'm going to push forward, and tell you what we're going to do to analyze this. So I didn't actually have to run a whole new experiment for this study. There was some data made available. This is out of some folks associated with the Good Judge Project. So this is Barbara Mellers and Phil Tetlock on this. They have an experiment where they're using basically the exact same paradigm I've been talking about, but to give people a chat room. And then I want to compare that against numeric exchange, combining different multiple experiments. I mentioned that one by Jan Lorenz and Dirk Helbing's group, the project I talked about earlier, and then the two political projects I did that had concretely objective answers. So what we end up with is 300-ish trials for chat room discussion and about 300 trials for numeric exchange. So what we do is for each trial, we measure at the beginning the proportion of people towards truth, and then we ask, did it improve or no? And now I'm binning the data together so I can get a probability of improvement. So what we get with the discussion trials, those 300 discussion trials, is that this proportion towards truth is highly predictive of outcomes in exactly the direction we'd expect. When the majority is on the truth side, discussion improves things. When the majority is away from discussion, makes things worse. This is very intuitive. We're saying that groups are drawn towards the opinion of the majority, right? That's exactly what we'd expect. But remember, this is not in any given trial. This is only in aggregate. In any given trial, they're really drawn towards the most talkative person. I did measure that, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. So it's a majority effect in aggregate, but it's not like that groupization literature where one group is drawn towards their own majority. Now, to see if this is really a feature of discussion, of course, we compare this against numeric exchange, where we find no systematic or either visually or statistically of the effect of initial belief distribution. Now, visually, I'm showing these as bins together, but underneath this is a logistic regression continuous effect. Now, even without arguing about network centralization, I'm already at a point to start to explain the apparently contradictory results of previous study. If you were back in the 60s and 70s and you were running your Delphi method study on a task that puts you in left-hand space, you're going to come away with the conclusion that numeric exchange is better than unstructured discussion. If you were to ask a task that puts you in the right-hand space, you'll come away with the conclusion that that discussion is better than numeric exchange. Now, the real issue here is that I'm comparing results across completely different studies with different questions conducted at different times. So what do? We pre-register an experiment using this to build our formal analyses, and then we replicate the whole thing. This is a study with, I'm acknowledging Ned Smith because he was very instrumental in getting this started. Due to health concerns, he's no longer an active author in this project. So the working paper is now out with Agnes Horvat here at Northwestern University in the communication department, and Abdullah Almaatouq at Sloan at MIT. So very briefly, what we do to replicate this whole thing, we recruit people from the web. They come in, a few hundred at a time, and then we randomly assign them to groups of 20. So we've got groups of 20. I'm interested in like committee-sized groups, large committee maybe. And then they're randomly assigned to either an open discussion, so we literally just put them in a chat room where they can type to each other, or they're in that numeric exchange condition where we're swapping numbers between them. And in this one, we're no longer showing the average alone, we're showing the average as well as the full list of numbers. We do 100 trials of each condition for a total of 4,000 unique respondents. Very briefly, we give the discussion groups 1 minute to read and provide the question, provide their initial estimate, 3 minutes in the chat room, 30 seconds to provide their final estimate. In the numeric exchange, we want to try to make sure there's also continual back and forth, so they're revising and contributing their estimates after every minute. Each group in total gets 4 minutes between seeing the question and providing their final estimate. So we're doing these different modes of communication as comparable as possible. We're also asking more complicated questions. We're not asking gumball questions anymore. We're asking things like, here's a description of a crowdfunding campaign. How much money did they raise? Here's a photo of a painting by Picasso. What price did it get at auction last year? Or, you know, here's how many flights went through Chicago, how many flights do you think went through New York City? The goal of this is both to try to get to some more practically meaningful questions, as well as to give something people can talk about for a few minutes. And anecdotally, I can say I've gone through and read the transcript, talking to people, they're sharing information for the crowdfunding campaign about a piece of video game equipment. One person said, "Oh, my son spends a ton of money on his game equipment," right? So they're sharing opinions very informally. So utilizing our interface. So very briefly, we replicated the results. Our results look a little bit messier. You see a lot of up and down in the data. Remember, we've got a third of the sample size. But by and large, we see the same effect where discussion is heavily driven by the initial belief distribution and numeric exchange is not. Now I'm going to show you, I'm going to give, I think I have another visual display of the data here. I'm going to pause for questions at this point. That's the main result. Everything else is kind of mechanism analysis. So
can I ask about the structure? So it sounds like the discussion was completely unstructured. People can choose when to speak and how much to speak. And it seems like goes back to Pinar's question before. It seems like there was two things which might develop separately. One is who I believe, and another one who decides to speak. And I wonder, apart from like who I believe, would that correlate with truth? How much also like who chooses to speak? Like, does it correlate with, do they know the truth? And also, I think there was a question in the chat, do they more likely to speak if they're a lot more in the majority versus minority? Because this seems to like what will determine how beliefs will change.
Yeah, so that's a good question. First of all, I can't really answer questions about who they're influenced by, because all I have is their discussion and their numbers. So I don't know who they're paying more attention to. In terms of who chooses to speak, there's no correlation between talkativeness and accuracy, either in the replication analysis or the reanalysis of old data. Empirically, we see a strong correlation between who the most talkative person in the group is and the direction the group goes in. So we're actually seeing this does, in fact, behave a lot like a star network. The question of are people more likely to speak if they're in the majority or minority? There is no real definition of a majority or minority. If we ask you how many jelly beans are in the jar, we just have a continuous distribution. I create theoretically a notion of majority and minority based on what side of the truth they're on, or what side of the mean they're on, but that's not something I would expect to be operational in the chat, because they may or may not even be aware of the mean, and people don't usually think of terms. So there's no clear majority minority, there's just a whole bunch of people with different numbers. So that is basically the summary of that study. I want to briefly acknowledge another study, and then I'm going to wrap this all up and spend the rest of the time on questions. Yeah, please.
Can I sneak a question in before we do more mechanism analysis? So yeah, the three examples you gave, at a squint, all three seemed like, I would personally sort of probably be making order of magnitude guesses because I'm not that informed on any of those. So I'm wondering if you had any questions in the population of 10 that were like, how tall was Richard Nixon, or like something that's arguably the errors are going to be more symmetric or like more less heavy-tailed, in terms of the fact that the distribution of the beliefs plays a role. So out of the 10, was there anything in there that like might have been less skewed?
So first I'll say I expect that even that question of how tall was Richard Nixon is going to get a skewed distribution. There's just this sense in which I can't go below 0, but I can go as high as I want. Maybe the skew is less. Seriously, I think that's my armchair explanation for why we can log normal. We did have questions, so we try to give people as much context as possible. So for the crowdfunding campaign, we're like, here's their target, here's their description, stuff like that. We actually want to be answerable questions, because the space we're getting to where people are estimating, operational questions or market analysis questions, they have some idea. So for example, we had some questions about how many gun deaths were in Chicago in, 2018. But we prefaced that question with, there were X number of gun deaths in Baltimore, X number in Philly. How many do you think there were in Chicago? So we're trying to give them some, we don't want them to just be coming up with numbers, because we're not really interested in studying the properties of random number generation. Yes-ish, that may not be totally convincing, but that's why I think we're getting real stuff here.
Yeah, I don't
okay.
categorize questions in terms of that, or results in terms of the distribution of the error. But yeah, I agree with you that there's probably by and large an order of magnitude process. Thanks.
And then my question, which I would love to hear in a minute, is how might I expect that to impact the social dynamic? But I'm going to breeze through a couple last points, really breeze through it. Briefly, we did actually try to measure effective network structure. We threw in Gini coefficient to talkativeness. I'm just going to summarize and say it's in the direction we expect. I'm not going to talk through this chart. Sorry for that. It's in the direction we expect. It's not statistically significant, but we see the same over 2 analyses. So I feel pretty confident that we're at least not falsifying our hypothesis about network structure driving this. This is the emergent network structure. And then when we look at who's talking the most, we do see a very strong statistical signal that when the talkative person is in the direction of truth, they get better. When it's not in the direction of truth, they get worse. So they're playing the role of that central node in the star node. And then I'm going to briefly close by just acknowledging another project, because I feel kind of ethically bound to acknowledge this. What we're seeing is some nice reliable conditions under which estimates get better, estimates get worse, but the picture can change dramatically when you think about decision making. So a question we might ask in the typical space is, how much will it cost to build a piece of software? My client management data, right? But when it comes down to the actual decision, it's like, I know I can buy one from this company for a fixed amount, or I can build one for an uncertain amount. My real question is that uncertain value above or below this threshold given by the buying choice? Which really comes down to a binary decision. You can think about 2 different ways of doing that. One is that people are in a committee meeting, they share their votes, they take a straw poll. What does everybody think? They talk for some more, they take another straw poll. We look at this both theoretically and empirically. We find that it just amplifies the initial majority. We don't see a of angry men type scenario except in really extreme edge cases. And it makes sense, right? If I'm already in the majority, why would I change my opinion? Which means that group dynamics in this case are not driven by accuracy, they're driven by the initial majority. So you think to yourself, okay, maybe I know numeric estimates become more accurate, so I'm going to have people form and exchange numeric estimates for voting. What we find, again, theoretically and empirically, is that this, again, mostly amplifies the majority. So all of it kind of falls apart when you start looking at the binary choice decisions. Having given that big caveat, I'm going to stop there and give the rest of the time to you all for discussion.
Thanks, Joshua. I was just thinking about this this case of, what's different between this method and the discussion. And the discussion can involve sort of different types of communication, not just the number, but it also, as you showed, there's a bunch of variation in how concentrated the discussion was in this Gini coefficient. Could you structure a discussion so that people are in turn taking, but not just exchanging numerical information, right? So that people would be exchanging unstructured messages, but would be essentially prompted to do so in intervals. Or, sometimes we try to do that if we're running a focus group, right? If you're running the focus group, you don't just sort of let the one person bully everybody. You specifically ask people for their opinion during this.
That's my hope. So, Paul, this points to the very well-known advice of don't let any one dominant leader drive a conversation. We see that in all sorts of group, team, decision-making type work. So this is giving that advice back to us for numeric estimates, and I like that we now have a nice formal foundation for it. The network perspective, which might seem a little bit like overkill just to talk about concentration of discussion, also points to potential solutions. So one that I'm going to speculate right now, I hope to test this or have some clear data on this, that you can set up a more sparse network. So maybe I'm in a group chat with these 3 other people and these 3 other people. They're each in group chats with other people in the committee or group. So we end up with, it's a bipartite network with overlapping group membership that can serve to allow people to just communicate as freely as they want, no rules whatsoever, but the broader structure keeps them in check. I also, one really nice intervention I had suggested to me once that I'd like to try is just putting clocks on the room, or these days, you know, putting counters in terms of who's talking for how much time, with the idea being that people might naturally go to a more egalitarian thing. So yes, the advice, there's a couple possible pieces of advice here. One is that if you can figure out what point of the parameter space you're in, you know, you can calibrate your particular process to that. If you can't, you can use some intervention to try to minimize centralization. And then, you know, similar questions about calibration versus process arise when you start thinking about binary versus numeric estimates.
I sort of have a high-level question. I mean, there are different types of problems in the world. There are some that is more like a beauty contest where you want to converge to some kind of a group characteristic, or there are questions where you know, like the cases that you've given, you know the truth a priori. Right? And it seems like the applications, I mean, at least what kind of prescriptive information you can give when you actually a priori know the truth from the wisdom of the crowd. That seems like a limited case to me.
Well,
so if you can just
so there, you definitely don't, I mean, you don't a priori know the truth. If we're going to sit here and say how much do we think GDP in the United States will grow in 2021, we know a priori that there is an objective truth. That's what you're talking about.
Or how can we measure the accuracy in cases like this?
Oh, well, one is we can wait. So a lot of the good judgment projects that they have this luxury of doing these really long-term projects where they ask people questions and then years later get the results. That's not something I've been able to do yet, although I've done that on the order of like a few weeks before with stock data that turns out not to be very interesting. So there are some strategies there. What I'm actually more interested in, I'm going to go another direction with this question, is the distinction between, forgetting about the Keynesian beauty contest, I think, the distinction between I know there's an objective truth and you'll be able to evaluate me on that someday versus there is no objective truth. So I'm working on this project. This is particularly important for like political questions or questions of prejudice. So you can imagine a question with an objective truth, like how many sick days on average do women take compared to men, right? We know we pick that up, ignore me on it, versus on a scale of 1 to 10, how much harder workers are women than men? They're kind of getting at some constructs, but one is objectively measurable, one is not. So all I can say right now is that that's a direction we're designing a study, and we're going to hopefully find even better pairs than that. I'm working on someone who actually does stereotype work, so they'll help me be less awkward about the type of questions. But the idea is we're going to get pairs of questions that touch the same concept as closely as possible. We present them as similarly as possible. One's objectively measurable, one's not. What we can't do is compare accuracy. There's no accurate answer to how hard men versus women work, but what we're going to compare is the direction and trajectory of the group responses. In particular, we can link this to things like polarization. So we take questions where we know there's a difference across groups, like especially beliefs about race and gender in the workplace and the underlying objective stats like relative income. We know that different groups give different answers. So we can see if they become more similar or less similar. The idea being that when there's an objectively accurate or true answer, we continue to see this accuracy dominate group dynamics, which means they're becoming more similar, versus in the nearly exact question, our hypothesis is that they're actually going to become more polarized, more driven by cognitive biases rather than accuracy. By the way, I acknowledge it's a couple minutes after guess I am.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this
people need to leave.
It sort of concludes the formal portion of this, but we can feel free to stick around for some further discussion for folks who have a little bit of time. I just wanted to highlight one pair of questions that came in from the Q&A from Ron that ask about just like the network topology and And I mean, as you said, you could think that actually in a lot of cases the discussion is star-like. You could also think of it as this kind of complete network. And how can you actually sort of maybe even theorize the edge structure? Are people addressing each other a lot? Is there a lot of addressing each other? Or if it's this group discussion, a lot of time it functions more like a broadcast, or as you said, maybe more like there's possibly a bipartite network if there's multiple groups.
I think there's a third way of thinking about it here, which is that, remember in the beginning, I said there's these two distinct ways of thinking about centrality. There's how many people I know and how influential are you on them. And this is actually one of the motivations getting into this, is that we often look at a conversation and say, oh, it's a fully connected network. You just have ones in all the cells of the density matrix, not interesting. But in fact, there is structure to that network. I'm super open ideas on how to do this. So far, I have no idea how to measure that network besides talkativeness, but I can think of who's influential on whom. So, you know, maybe some people in here, everybody's talking equally, but some I've met before and some I haven't met before. So for whatever reason, I place more weight on the people I've met before than I haven't. So there's outgoing ties. There are other ways to be persuasive that can increase my influentialness on everybody. Again, being taller, you know, being more talkative. So I'll say yes, it's a fully connected network and it has structure to it, because we're actually looking at a weighted network or a weighted adjacency matrix, which of course we can also measure centralization on, but now it's that influence centralization. So I think of that as the difference between a communication network, who talks to whom, and the influence network of who is attending to whom.
The other thing I wanted to return to, because people had asked about this, was incentives. That it seemed like, precisely with Pinar's question, it brings up this idea that, well, in the case, not only where you can't measure how accurate people are for your study, but you can't incentivize them in the same way. And so, I mean, have you considered mixing in other incentive schemes? I mean, you have things like Bayesian truth serum, you have other sorts of like kind of crowd prediction sort of judgments. And I wonder, it seems like that could be really important to putting any of this into practice, would be knowing how to incentivize people when you don't know the answer.
Yeah, so for me personally, it always comes down to the question of what alternative hypotheses would this generate? Like how would incentives impact the results? One way it could impact the results, I don't have any formal theory of this, is just armchair theorizing, is if you somehow gave people an incentive to be dishonest. So we've been pretty careful in avoiding that because we don't want to deal with that, because I don't really know what would happen if people are dishonest. For me, in a lot of the settings I've thought through, I assume people's interests are aligned. They're a team who all wants the same outcome. So acknowledging that's kind of simplified, but I don't yet, so I'm aware of the issue. I will say no, I haven't considered doing it in my own experiments, because so far I haven't really thought of anything interesting to go in that particular direction. But there are,
I guess I was thinking it not so much as a hypothesis, but just if we wanted to put what you learned into practice, we usually would be doing it in a case where we're not going to be able to use the incentive scheme that you're using.
Right. So my assumption is that people are incentivized accurate, even if they're paid to be accurate, which is to say they want to give the correct answer. I mean, yeah, I would love to hear arguments otherwise. I guess I'm revealing that I haven't really thought too much about why someone might be incentivized to be dishonest, other than the competitive situation, which I've tried to avoid. Briefly, I also want to acknowledge another issue that's becoming potentially important is individual incentives versus group incentives. That seems to mainly impact the sources of information that people are going to. Again, that's by Niccolo Pescatelli, does really very clever stuff there. But my paradigm so far has been like, I assume they're now sequestered in the room. This is like the jury closed off. They're not getting any new information. So that's a boundary condition that I acknowledge is not always true. We're often truth seeking. And another incentive, this isn't what you're asking about, but I'm going to acknowledge it. We are measuring error in terms of either squared error of the average or absolute deviation. But whether or not your group improves in a way that improves your payoff, right? You have to actually think about the cost function of the error, which is something that I have thought a little bit about how it might impact. So whether you measure, let's see, I'll just briefly say, I might have 99 trials, or 100 trials, 99 of them get a little bit better, and that one remaining trial gets way worse. So on average, you could say, well, our average error got worse. But you could also say 99% of the times we got better. So which one is more meaningful to group depends on your payoff function for the cost of error. I just wanted to acknowledge that. I realize it doesn't quite directly address your question.
So one thought I had coming out of this, particularly the way that you were contrasting kind of the numeric communication, we'll call it, and the deliberation, the more kind of human communication. So like this sort of circles back to something I think it was Pinar who raised, which was about the idea that, you know, things like the median, or how are you summarizing the information? Maybe it wasn't Pinar, but it was like, how are you summarizing the information? Are you summarizing it based on the average, or how are you summarizing it based on the median? And the fact that those are very different for skewed distributions. So a natural question that sort of is more complicated than that question is to ask, is there some kind of like centaur perfect world where like the aggregation is done so that to optimize it for human input, because humans know how to think about medians better than means, and then you sort of like leave the computers to do the computation and leave the humans to do the deliberation. I don't know what that would look like, but it would be interesting to think about kind of like, how do you optimize the role of computation? I mean, it's sort of like a human computation question for this, to improve accuracy. Yeah, I don't know, just floating.
And you specifically talking about that, how it's displayed? Is that what you're?
Yeah, like sort of like, you know, everyone does their initial guess, and then you like, you know, I'm gonna be sarcastic here and just say like, let an AI like somehow present the information. And sort of optimize it, optimize it for like human reading would be like the objective that the presentation would be. Yeah.
I'll be honest, I have no idea. I know we're not supposed to say that, but I don't want to just wildly speculate off the top of my head. I'll say there's a little bit of evidence that has looked at like how, you know, if you show someone a histogram, they, you know, they appear to be swayed by the average. So there's some evidence, very minimal evidence of that kind of reanalysis of some of this experimental data. There's a little bit of evidence of some studies that have done a couple different versions. Doesn't seem to make much of a difference in these broad questions. But right, if you're talking about optimizing, like we want to squeeze every little bit of accuracy out of it, it could make a huge difference. I don't see myself personally studying that particular factor anytime soon. But I will say, I love it because the AI plus CI is a very hot topic right now. Also, I think you still have a couple weeks. Nesta UK is a funding organization. They have a collective intelligence arm, and they're specifically funding projects this year for people who combine AI and CI. And I was like, oh, I can't apply because I don't do that kind of stuff. But if anybody really likes that, there's a grant out there to apply for. It's like $10,000. It's not big, but it's a very topical question. Yeah.
Related to this, maybe we did a sort of a working study, working paper, a bunch of experiments in group setting where people exchanged information about, like, this was a donation setting where they initially decided and shared with us how much they would like to donate to an organization, and then we allowed them to exchange information, or we allowed them we showed the information about the group donation decisions, and then sort of did an eye tracking to see how people selected the information based on their initial condition, and then how they later, seeing this information, change their donation amounts. And there you can see that it's, even if you provide them all with the same information, they all receive, for instance, the entire group information, they don't necessarily focus on the information in the same way. So their initial condition, initial decision sort of helps them or guides them in selecting information, self-selecting into certain information that conforms to their prior sort of belief, prior distribution. So we can talk about that later, but I'm not so sure, even if you show them the entire distribution, that they will be processing the information in the same way based on the results that we've seen.
Yeah. No, I'm inclined to agree with you And I was only mentioning that kind of scattered evidence that exists so far just to acknowledge that, I mean, there's a difference again between these big picture dynamics of like, what are the groups doing at the broadest level? And then the like, now we want to hone in and optimize really specifically. So there's that. There's also, you're going to get a lot of different effects when you get out of this accuracy space. So that's where I would think things like cognitive biases become particularly important. I'm actually, so in that context, I love this idea, and it's something I'll probably want to address as we move into. I mentioned I'm working on this project to compare like objective versus subjective questions, because whether you believe motivated reasoning is real or not, I know that's a very disputed question. This idea of selective information when I have a bias is something that could play a huge role. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think Amin also had a question about the optimality of being a devil's advocate. Actually, Amin, you want to ask your question? Yeah.
Yeah, just since the issue of incentives came up, I wanted to point out that if you move away from a fixed behavioral model, like a don't fix that the group model, then in a Bayesian model, there could be an incentive for being untruthful. Like, for example, if your optimal belief is something, you report something to the extreme and away from your optimal belief, just so others in response to your untruthful report would be saying something that then you can argue on and extract maximal information about them. So if you, for example, you discuss the number of communications in the future, then there is a exploitation trade-off that, how much you're prepared to wait, how patient you are for communication, and then how much you have to deviate away from the truth in your reports to others.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm understanding you correctly, that would come back to incentives as well, because if I'm incentivized for the group to be most accurate, now I might be dishonest. If I think the group is too high, I'm going to give a super low answer to try to pull the group down, right? In the individual accuracy, in the individual incentive condition, that would hurt me. In the collective incentive decision, that would help me. I would expect to find those things. It doesn't seem to be that simple. One of the data sets that I did my reanalysis on, there's 300 discussion trials. That was actually about half and half collective incentive and individual incentive, or rather group incentive and individual incentive. And in their original paper on that, they just lumped it all together because they found no difference. And I studied that data for a while because I wanted to figure out whether or not it mattered for my experiment. So at the least at the very basic level, telling people you're incentivized individually or you're incentivized to have the group be accurate doesn't seem to make any difference, which is to say either it doesn't lead to these kinds of behaviors or it doesn't lead to these kind of behaviors in a large enough amount that it changes the results, or these behaviors don't change the results. Either way, I do believe that you're right, because it just makes so much sense, but actually pulling that out turns out to be a little bit tricky. You can't just kind of set people up and say, okay, now go do your thing. I don't know, maybe it's as simple as
so that I make sure I'm understanding that Amin's point would be true even if I'm only incentivized individually, because if I'm incentivized based on my final answer, not my intermediate answers, or my final answer is much more heavily incentivized than my earlier answers, I still may want to provide extreme intermediate answers so as to probe the certainty of everyone else.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
And extract a maximum amount of information.
Could be, yeah. So one comment is that we did actually incentivize at all the intermediate ones because we were trying to get rid of that kind of effect. That's interesting. I think it comes down to whether MTurkers would think like you, or whether we're not, of course, at the end of the day interested in MTurkers, but interested in people in an office, because you've got a couple things going on here. I think the real leap to make is that there's this notion of certainty in the group, and I'm trying to probe it by throwing the group a curveball and then seeing if they react to the curveball, which suggests the group isn't very confident, or seeing if they ignore my curveball, which suggests the group is confident. I don't know. I think that's going to depend a lot on who you're working with. Just to highlight, a lot of the stuff we're talking about comes down to who is your group. So does your group have accuracy confidence correlations? Do they have a norm of turn taking? Do they have a clearly identified leader who's always right? All these different things come up. I mean, personally, you know, if I'm a manager, that's really what I'm going to do. I'm not going to take any kind of blanket recommendation, but I'm going to think about my group and my task and how I can get the best out of it. I will also acknowledge something that's becoming more apparent to me the more and more I talk about this is I forget. So I come from a professional background where I'm a mediator. People bring me in to run a facilitated process. So for me, it's totally just my deep assumption is that when people make really important decisions, well, they're sitting down and saying, how should we run this process? And let's bring someone in to help us run this process. When of course, you know, or decision making in the wild is often a lot more haphazard. You know, James March has some really great discussions about various on that. So there's sort of two different ways of thinking about this work. One of which is how do we design optimal processes? That is my sort of default thing. But then there's also just uncovering all these dynamics to kind of know, given the groups are already doing X in the wild, how is that impacting their outcomes? Yeah.
Given the discussion of incentives, I'll throw one reference into the conversation, which is Aaron Shaw had a paper with collaborators who I forget the names of about 10 years ago that tried to look at on MTurk, sort of try 10 different question or elicitations with incentives and without incentives to see what gave the most accurate answers. And it was everything from sort of like scoring rules to like Bayesian truth theorem to just like norms, like various like language or personalized norm, like, you know, I'm Aaron, please help me in my work. Sort of like, how do you get MTurkers to be as accurate as possible? And there are relative differences, but they're not huge. The concern there was that like MTurkers are just being kind of like random zombies when they're responding to your surveys. And it's unclear if it means that they're random zombies across all conditions or if they were accurate across all conditions. Like it's, you know, but it's the best paper I've seen on that, but it's now maybe 10 years old and it'll be interesting to see a revisitation. There might be one if one does a citation search.
Interesting, yeah. So yeah, our MTurkers random zombies. I don't know, anecdotally, I can say that people in our discussion conditions are not random zombies because I can read their chat messages. I also have a couple hoops people have to jump through. So there's no bots can get through and people who are impatient can't get through because frankly, it's kind of a pain in the ass. Participate in one of my studies. I don't even know why they do it, except for that we pay pretty well. Really, I go for, you know, minimum wage here in Chicago is like $13 an hour now. But it's possible it got random zombies in the number condition and not in the discussion condition. I don't know. Although I think what I'm hearing in Aaron's paper is it's all this independent, collected and type stuff. And then even besides Aaron's paper, there's tons of stuff on calibrating independent. And for me, that's sort of a problem opportunity, which is that I have now some ideas about how we would optimize a group, but we also have tons of ideas about how to optimize individuals, and they haven't yet, as I know, started to really intersect, except for a little bit in this question of incentives. But like, yeah, what if you put a Bayesian truth theorem question somehow into your group discussion, where we were talking about devil's advocate a minute ago. There's a great study that just came out, I want to say like a week ago or something, or I saw it on Twitter a week ago, where they actually asked people in a control condition versus this treatment condition was, imagine a person who usually disagrees with you. What would they say? And just by like imagining that person who usually disagrees with you versus imagining a person who always agrees with you, they're, you know, able to get accuracy differences. Now, some of that, you know, maybe what's happening in conversation, we're forced to confront people who disagree with us, but you can imagine combining all these purposes. So I think that the next step has to be some kind of massive multifactorial experiment that's putting all these things in like a horse race to compare different kind of stuff. Although that's, I am not as much in the like pure optimization space personally as I am in the like basic science broad strokes theory of group, but absolutely I think eventually we're just gonna have to, if we really want to adjust this systematically, to start pairing them all up because there are only so many questions you can answer theoretically.
Cool. That last bit about imagining someone who disagrees with you makes me think of some kind of disagreeing crowd within, which I know is something that Johan has worked on. So that's a cool final reference for us all. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up today's talk. Thanks so much, Joshua, for the talk, and thanks for joining us, Pinar and Johan, and then in the end, Amin as well.